Hello and welcome to another episode of AR Chat. I'm really looking forward to today's episode. You've got your hosts, as always, me, Stephen Dickens, Crystal Golightly, and Nathan Herpert. But you've also got a fantastic guest this week, Matt Eastwood from IDC. Hey, Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Crystal and Nathan, for having me today. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Likewise.
So, I think, guys, let's let Matt introduce himself, if such an introduction is even necessary. If you're in analyst relations, particularly in the sort of infrastructure space, and you don't know Matt, then kind of where have you been living? Have you been living under a rock? But let's do some introductions. So I think it's going to be fascinating what you do for IDC and just the size and breadth of the team that you look after.
Yeah, no, sure. So I've been in this space for 25 years now as an analyst. I came in after having a little bit of a prior life as an environmental engineer. But over the last couple of decades, I've been working with some of the biggest tech vendors, tech buyers, tech investors in the world, and I've really seen firsthand how analyst relations has evolved, how the role of an analyst has evolved from something that was a bit less formal and maybe a bit more reactive into something that's a lot more strategic today. And it's really been fascinating, I think, to reflect on where this all started. We could talk about that today. And even more exciting to think about where we're headed with AI, how research firms are changing, how the influencer models are changing, how we all work together, all of that. So, yeah, to your point, Stephen, I mean, the team I manage today is about 100 analysts, and it covers really everything related to infrastructure, cloud, security. We cover telecom channels, systems management, application development. We really cover everything kind of up to the middle level of the stack. We don't get into applications or professional services or industries, but we really cover everything, all the plumbing and all the enabling tech underneath that.
So, Crystal, this is where we turn to you and you ask your fantastic initial question to get us rolling.
Absolutely. So, Matt, I'm so curious always about how do things begin, right? And so, um, yeah, you've been around for 25 years. So we know that AR has only been around as long as high tech has been around. So obviously longer than 25 years. But when you were starting, where were we? Describe that, who was around on the AR world?
Yeah, so when I think about even before, our any of our time in this industry, so IDC just celebrated last year its 60th anniversary as a company. So the company was founded in 1964. And if you go all the way back, it was really a world of, kind of IBM and the seven dwarfs. And you had the entire market was really defined by big mainframes, big systems. We didn't have an ISV marketplace. We didn't have professional services. We didn't have distributed edge infrastructure. We just had big systems. And that was really the starting point for what we did. If I think about how analyst relations has evolved and how firms like IDC and Gartner have evolved, I think when we began to really shape and define tech markets, and we started to see things shifting in the way before my time again in the 70s, but really in the 1980s when you started to see like emergence of the PC and ecosystems and this notion of co-opetition, we started to really see the market become a lot more complicated. And we really started to see the development of analysts and analyst relations landscaped. So I think, executives initially were engaging directly with analysts. I think there were folks from the PR side involved. But once tools like the Magic Quadrant really emerged, I think vendors realized that they needed somebody to be a bit more dedicated in terms of how they manage these relationships. So if I had to guess, I'd say the first true AR pro was probably in the late 80s, early 90s, and it probably was somebody inside of HP or IBM would be probably where it would have started.
That's what we've heard consistently so far. So I think we're narrowing in on HP or IBM, one of the big mainframe companies potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got to be that kind of vintage. You look at, Matt, what you say, where the industry was back then, who were the big firms? what they would have been engaging with an IDC or a Gartner about, it's got to be back to one of those types of firms. Maybe a Cisco back in the day, but it's going to be somebody, maybe an Intel going all the way back. It's going to be one of these OG firms, as I describe them, that's been around since the sort of late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, I would agree because I think if you think about what happened in the early 80s, that was really the emergence of this kind of second wave of our industry. But Cisco, Sun Microsystems, EMC, Oracle, even Intel and the PC. Intel goes back to the late 60s, but really they became kind of more of a household name in the 80s. And so I think the market really went into kind of its second chapter in the 80s and really began to accelerate. But I would agree it goes back to what was happening in those big systems companies. And I think as this happened, I think AR, the vendors realized that analysts weren't just content creators. We were really about defining markets and looking at the interrelationship between markets, and things really got a lot more interesting in the 80s from that perspective.
So, Matt, I've got a question for you. You said that the 80s and 90s, the market was complicated. So, three-part question. First part, how would you describe the market today? How does that affect the work of an analyst, for better or worse? And then how does that affect the work of an analyst relations professional, for
Yeah,
better
I
or
mean, the
worse?
market, I mean, I think it's funny. One of the things I always say about tech, and this is more from an end user perspective, but it's a giant hairball. Like things just get layered on, more and more complicated. And I think that's the nature of our industry. So it's really hard to survive and have a strong vendor voice for as long as, say, a company like IBM or HP has had. But a lot has happened. We were talking about the 80s and what emerged. And if you look at it kind of in these chapters, we at IDC started talking about the third chapter or the third platform in around 2010 or so, with the emergence of mobile, the emergence of data cloud. So we were talking about kind of analytics and sentiment data and social data and how that was really stirring the pot. And now the world with AI, it really just keeps building on that. And so now we're in this era of, I think there's a lot of excitement in the industry right now about what the promise of AI means for all layers of our technology stack, and what it means for an end user of being able to use technology much more effectively and much more efficiently in how they make decisions and drive their business.
So, what do you think that means for kind of analyst relations and analysts and then AR pros? Somebody like me from an analyst perspective, somebody like Nathan from an AR pro perspective.
Yeah, so by the time we get to today, I mean, I would say vendors are treating analysts not just as researchers, but more as almost strategic gatekeepers to the market. So part of what we bring as analysts to the equation is a form of kind of almost a constant, where typically analysts sit and roll for a long time, and we have a fairly long purview of what's been happening, and we can trace through some of these historical shifts that have happened and the interdependencies and what that's meant. And again, I think that's really what's happening here again. So there's always all this change, and people are changing seats around our industry all the time. But I do think that as much as anybody, analysts tend to be a bit of a constant in trying and presenting kind of a fairly consistent view of things. And that tends to be where we push back as well. We'll push back on people that make, maybe a little bit overzealous claims about being first in something or being a leader in something, where there's always context that needs to be provided to put a little bit of shape to those claims, to make sure that they're truly honest and accurate. And there are inflections, but oftentimes, to use that hairball analogy, things just keep building off of things that have happened previously.
To tee Crystal up, something her and I have talked a lot about lately is we are absolutely in the age of analysts as strategic partners. It's not a one-way relationship. It never was, and it never should have been. But even more so today, it is a healthy two-way relationship. So, Crystal, take it away, because I know you had something on the tip of your
Well,
tongue.
yeah, I mean, in that vein, what I was really thinking that it was really interesting that you frame the analyst position in that way, Matt, because it seems like as we introduce AI as a tool, everyone's talking about efficiencies, right? And they're looking to do more and faster and with higher quality and more thoughtfulness. And one of the trends that it seems is happening is there is some consolidation of roles or more overlap, specifically when it comes to AR and how they help illustrate the value of the analyst relationship. So it's almost like that competitive intelligence or that market analysis aspect becomes a critical tool for AR people, right? So I really like that you really brought that up as looking at a market perspective, because it always kind of baffled me why AR and CI was not closer in relationship or integrated, because it seems almost do I say this publicly, like almost nonsensical that they're not in cooperation, you
Yeah.
know?
Right. Yeah, no, and I would agree. And I think, I mean, if I think about this, the constituents and the stakeholders that we work with the most, obviously we're working with the AR community all the time. But to your exact point, Crystal, we talk a lot with the market intelligence folks, the competitive intelligence folks. And I think what's interesting about all three of those is, particularly when you get into things like MI and CI, it's really what people want is the truth. So it's really about, in the conversations we have, it's really about an unfiltered truth. So we're not out to embarrass anybody, but at the same time, what we tend to find when we're having conversations with, say, like market intelligence, is they really just want to get, in fact, you could get market intelligence professionals in the room from competitors, and they'll basically ask the same questions and they'll want the same answers, which is pretty interesting. It's not about spin. It's really about, hey, let's cut through this and let's really try to understand what's happening here, because we need those answers in order to help guide our own executives and our own decision making.
It's interesting, Matt. A huge fan of AI, but I think, and I've maybe had an advisory heavy week, so this is kind of in my mind, thinking back to a session I did with an SVP and his leadership team this week. What they actually want is context. They want a partner they can think through a business strategy. You know, they want somebody who can think as a peer about their business, bring in context, bring in a broader lens. I spend a lot of my time in these advisory conversations. The teams are this close to something. They need the perspective. They need that market landscape. I was talking to this vendor. They were talking about making a switch from perpetual licenses to subscription. And it was the context of having that conversation with a couple of other vendors and the things that I observed with those other vendors who were 3 or 4 years ahead of them on this strategy. Completely different product, completely different space, but being able to bring that broader context of this is how that vendor's gone through the process. This is the impact that this other vendor's had and the pitfalls that they've fallen into. Yes, you can ask those questions of a chat GPT and you're going to get, but it's that fine-grained context. There's a lot of discussion in our community around, and I'm getting to a question, don't worry, Matt. There's a lot of discussion around AI and the use of it. Is that what you're seeing in your interactions? Because that's what I'm seeing. It's actually making the individual and the context and the analyst more valuable rather than less valuable. Is that the transition you're seeing?
Yeah, I think, I mean, at the end of the day, what we do kind of day to day, and this, I mean, I know you feel this as well, Stephen, is it's a business of relationships. And where I think where the AR community and the analyst community are very well aligned is, for this to work well for the AR professionals and for the analysts, we need good engagement on the executive side of the vendor world as well. And when you get, I mean, that's what we see day in and day out, is when there's good executive support for analyst relations programs, that tends to be where the analysts really want to lean in and talk. And then it becomes about relationships, and it becomes about exactly what you said, Stephen, which is, okay, there's a lot of noise out there, and AI just makes that worse. On steroids, there's just more content than ever, and it's going to explode every year going forward until the end of time. And how do you filter through that? And the reality is, it really is in conversations and really looking at the nuance behind what's happening and trying to understand that. So there's this natural hype cycle in our industry, and you really need to kind of strip that away and help people understand through even research, where you start to look at maturity models and what's happening and who's likely to be the earliest adopter and why and where you're going to tend to see the laggards. And this AI conversion that's going on is, we're in the first inning of a 9 inning baseball game. It's going to be happening for a decade. So let's talk about where it's happening today and where the opportunities are today, and let's avoid spending a lot of time and money trying to convince somebody to do something they're not ready to do. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do in the discussions we have with the executive community.
You've kind of hit on this, but I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to throw the first one out, and then I'll throw the second out. The first one is, how has your interaction with analyst relations programs changed throughout your career? Because undoubtedly, analyst relations has a very strong heritage in the kind of comms world, right? To help with product messaging. I don't want to call it spin because I don't like the word spin, but product messaging. And how has that changed? Maybe as the center of gravity has changed for an AR team.
No, it's a great question, Nathan. And I was thinking about that before the call today. So, as we talked about already, the analyst ecosystems exploded. I know that you talk about, I think, something like 7,000 active analysts out there. There's a big community, right? And it's not just the big firms, the Gartners, the Forresters, the IDCs. There are really thousands of independent analysts and influencer analysts shaping the conversations across every niche of our industry. Some go deep on cloud or AI or security. Others build reach around things like LinkedIn and YouTube. And for AR teams, this really means about engaging with a much broader mix of voices, where the reach is, how it resonates, where the relevance is, all of that. It's no longer about managing a handful of relationships. It's really an ecosystem play. And I think the old AR playbook was pretty straightforward. It was, come out, and we would see this even when I started, brief the big three firms. Somebody would come to Cambridge and they meet with IDC, and they'd meet with IDC in Framingham. They go to Cambridge for Forrester. They go down the road to Stanford and see Gartner. It doesn't work that way anymore. It's not enough. The ecosystem is way too fragmented. It's moving too fast. It's really about orchestrating a mix of tier one firms, boutiques, independents, and even social influencers. And so AR really has to manage this traditional research with these real-time social signals, podcasts, blogs, all of it. It's all part of the strategy. It's all part of the storytelling. It's part of the science that's relationships. And you're not really just influencing a report anymore. You're really trying to influence a conversation, in my mind.
So if I put you in, sorry, Crystal, there's one other question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
If I put you, like, let's say you weren't at IDC, if I put you at a large enterprise and said, build your strategy, analyst relations, comms team of choice, how would you construct things? Would competitive intel and AR be hand in hand? Would it be AR and communication? This is something I'm personally passionate about because I have a theory. I want to hear yours.
I mean, I still think probably what still works best, or what's working best today, is really the intersection of AR and comms. I mean, I think the MI and the competitive piece are immediate adjacencies, but I sometimes think that that's a little bit different personality type, because oftentimes, like I said, they're really trying to cut through all of the noise and really get to the honest answer, honest assessment of what's happening. Where I do think, when in the world of AR, it is about telling a story. It's about making sure there's a consistent understanding across the industry, in the analyst world, and beyond, with what is happening in any given firm, what the focus is, what the strategic imperatives are, how they're shaping up to really execute in the market. That's really important. And I do think that's more of a communication story. And if you think about what I said a few minutes ago and all the different media and mediums that we work in, it takes somebody that has a command of that and understands how those all fit together to do it effectively, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I like that.
So I wanted to hone in on one thing that you said, Matt, a couple of times, was the value of relationship. And that's a big topic right now as the computers and math help us become more effective, right? And so I love that you talk about that relationship aspect, and I also really appreciate the fact that you acknowledge that there is this whole ecosystem of analysts that either are broad or they're with big firms or smaller firms, and they have their niche and their specialities. Because I read some research that was promoted by an AR person yesterday or this week. Jay Moore, I don't know if you know him at he's at Capgemini net. No, he's at Wipro.
Right, right. Yeah, I know
Yeah,
Jay.
you know Jay. Okay,
Yep.
I'll have to fact check myself there. My brain is hiccuping, but he had shared a piece that Phil First from HFS had posted all about the why essentially of the relationship, right? And there's this contextual part. Um, and I really think that's the core part of the relationship, right? Is that AI helps us categorize and summarize and do very specific things, but there are parts like intonation, historical, um, leanings, all of these different things that is really not computable, at least yet, right? That is very human, that is so important. So, yeah, I like that you tell this story and it's not all about, these boxes that we all have to move forward. So,
Yeah, AI is going to be really fascinating to watch. I mean, and not to oversimplify it, but it's kind of like what I went through when I was in high school and college with saying that using a calculator in math class. Initially, people are like, "Oh, how dare you? You need to really learn how to do arithmetic." Well, the reality is it helped you go faster, but you still need to understand how these concepts work, what the rules are in math and algebra. It's the same with AI, right? AI is really going to reshape AR from the inside out. It's going to automate a lot of the more grunt parts of our jobs, briefing prep, how you track sentiments, competitive scans, so that you as AR pros can focus more on the strategy and on the storytelling. And the same is true in reverse for analysts. I mean, it helps us go faster, but you do really need to understand how to use it as a tool and apply it effectively so that you're not just cranking out more pages, you're still you're still producing content that is really interspersed with a lot of value and a lot of things that people sentiments that people can draw from. So in my mind, it really raises the bar. It makes us all bring sharper insights to market faster. It's really about recognizing how the value comes from the interpretation and not just from the information. And the machines can only help us so much with that because at the end of the day, we're people and we really need to synthesize how different people receive and process information. And that's what we do as analysts. We put ourselves in different seats and we try to say, well, this is how I think a CIO would think of it, or how a CFO might think of it, or a CMO. And we're really trying to wear those different hats and bring that perspective to the work that we do.
I
The
think
way
that's so important.
the
Go
way I
ahead.
look at it is, you've got a big team of 100 analysts, and there's probably research assistants and juniors in that team, Matt. I look at it as running a smaller team. It's the ability for me to have smart interns doing work that gets me from zero to first sort of version. And that's where the work starts. That's where the insight starts. That's where
Yeah.
the perspectives, that's where the context, that's where you're lucky that you've got a big team and you've got people who can do that. But in a smaller team, I've got to leverage those tools and get better at those tools to be able to, if I've got to write a white paper or research a topic or get prepped for an advisory call, the time I'm spending, I had to go and research a particular topic. I'm a mainframe guy. I'm pretty good at that space. I get to spend a bunch of time with Matt and his team at these events. But even that, there's parts of the space where I'm like, I know what that is, but I don't track it.
Yeah.
So I had to go and do an advisory for a client. And you've got to spend 2 or 3 days going down a rabbit hole of just, okay. And previously, my going down the rabbit hole would have started with a Google search. That was probably what I would have done 3 or 4 years ago, and then just gone and read a bunch of papers and now my Google search is replaced by a sort of Gemini and Grok type of deep research. But I've still got to read all of that stuff. I've still got to go down the rabbit hole of reading the citations. But what I've done is I've accelerated that process by lopping off the sort of first part of it. So I think it's leveling up everything we do, but it's not changing the final part of the process, which is the context and the value of, my grey hairs and Matt's grey hairs
Yeah.
have been able to look at this space and go, what's the market actually need? Yes, maybe it took a week-long task and turned it into a 2-day task, but they've still got to do the task, is my point. Am
Yeah,
I
and I
a
think
long rambling answer, Matt? But is that what you're seeing?
and I sort of think two things when you say that, Stephen. So one is a conversation I've had with a bunch of different analyst relations professionals. I think they've been on your podcast recently, but people like Aaron Zare and Gina Blatt about how we, as more senior seasoned analysts, can grow the next generation of analysts and how we can mentor them and bring them into the fold so they can experience a conversation that, say, Stephen, you and I might have with an executive, a C-suite person. That's not something that necessarily comes naturally to somebody that's just getting started. And it's good for them to get a chance to see what the shapes of those conversations look like. And very much related to that is how we can build and develop what we describe as T-shaped analysts. So analysts that can go very deep in a domain, but they're also effective at going fairly wide and broad as well, because you have to connect all these things together. And I think your mainframe piece of this, to almost go back where we started, is really apropos here, because if you talk about a mainframe and talk about, so IBM just launched Z17, and we go to New York and we hear about that. Well, what you'll see in the room is a lot of T-shaped people and a lot of folks that focus on adjacency. So they might not be a full-time mainframe follower, but they follow security, or they look at data analytics and databases, or they look at development frameworks. So they look at things that really matter to IBM in this case, that wants to sell a modern mainframe. So I think that's the world that we increasingly live in, is connecting these really deep coverages with something that's a bit broader and contextual. And then it's our job as people that have been doing this for a while to try to bring the next generation forward to continue this and help them understand what we do, why we do it the way we do, and so forth. I think we kind of owe that to our industry.
Matt, I think the concept of a T-shaped analyst can be perfectly placed on top of analyst relations as well. I think a modern AR pro has to be T-shaped. The
Mm-hmm.
key element of it going wide is probably the analyst landscape. Like you said, you need to know your independent influencers. You need to know your independent influencer analysts. You need to know your core analysts and maybe traditional firms. Then the deep part of the T is the domain that you occupy, right? So, and that changes for analyst relations pros because there's only a few of us. So maybe for 5 years, it's mainframes. And
Right.
then, the next 5 years of your career, maybe you're in telecoms. But T-shaped, I like that. I'm going to steal that. I think that that's really, really accurate.
And you
I
And, I,
think
and I've said it that way too, Nathan. I think if you're a good analyst, you should be able to analyze anything, right? You're going to need to
mhm.
learn some of these technologies and learn the competitive landscape, but you can take that skill set and apply it to anything. And
Just watch Matt
sometimes,
and I go back and forth on Blue Sky talking about politics and the Mac. I think I genuinely believe something's in there. Yes, you've got a domain expertise, but it's that critical thinking and being able to look at something and go, okay, this is how I would pull that apart. I mean, I'm not a Tesla autonomous autonomous vehicles analyst. I'm not in that space, but I love pulling apart Tesla's valuation. And Matt and I have gone around this on social platforms, and Matt's pulling apart the same thing from his perspective.
Yeah.
Neither of us are Tesla or autonomous vehicles experts, but we bring the perspective of an analyst pulling apart their valuation, what we think they're doing, to be able to form a mental model. So I think there is something in, and when I get into an adjacent space or something that's not as close to my background, the model comes across with me of how I pull something apart. So there is a lot to be said for that kind of thought process and critical
I
thinking.
know we're running up against time, but I think you're also hitting on something important, both of you, which is it's a commonality between analysts and analyst relations professionals. It's that ability to think critically, to take those
Hmm.
innate skills and apply them to whatever domain they occupy at that time. And that is some of that common ground I think we talk about on here between the profession, right?
Yeah, for sure.
If I
Yeah, and
could
if I,
pull, I'm
sorry,
sorry. I'm going to cue you up, I promise. I'm going to pull a string from our first episode, which was with Gina Blatt. And she talked about how in the changing landscape, where there used to be cooperation, there now may be competition, because even though you didn't compete, because there's so much synergies and so much I guess transformation in the technologies where all of these adjacencies sort of meld, it only makes sense that as the technology is changing, all of our roles are too, right?
Mhm.
And we have to get ready for that. And I just want to say we usually wrap this up with asking about the future. And Matt, I think you kind of already summed up your observations, but I'll give you an opportunity to,
Any final thoughts?
yeah.
Okay, no, that's great. I appreciate that. So if I kind of leave everybody with one thing, I'd say that, and it's just going to build on what we said. I think analyst relations, it's just becoming more essential in this world that we're heading into. The analyst ecosystem is growing more diverse and more dynamic. And in my mind, the most successful AR pros are not just managing relationships, they're really helping connect the dots across strategy, across storytelling, across influence. And I don't fear AI. I don't think AI is replacing us. It's freeing all of us up to spend time doing things that we think matters more. So for me, in this space, that's how do we get to trusted insights faster? How do we get to strategic impact more effectively? For IDC, what we're really trying to do is deliver answers, not just reports. So how can we get past just data points and forecasts and really connect the dots more effectively and drive decisions and intelligence that's relevant, timely, and tailored. So it's kind of meeting the person where they are with the right information at the right time. And that's our job as analysts. And I think in the world of AR, it's very similar.
Well, I don't think I can say anything else to wrap us up any better than that, Matt. You've been listening to another episode of AR Chat. Please click, subscribe, share, and tell the community about this. We're trying to build something here. It's been great to have Matt on the show. Please check out our next episode, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.